from the Prime Minister to make his case and open and start this debate. You're here.
Right. Mr. Speaker, we believe that democracy as we have it now is somewhat illusionary. We think that we have this idea that we, the people, run our countries and run our governments, but we think that this is not really the case in modern democracies. Since we live in countries that are too large to have direct democracy where us as individuals are carriers of little pieces of sovereignty and we therefore create unified policies, we in fact live in representative democracies where we elect people who are our voices, who carry our individual sovereignty, galvanize it, and then turn it into government, which turns it into policy. Way too many steps if you ask us. What we want to argue as side proposition is, one, the people have no say in forming governments. They have say in forming the representative body, the legislative, but which is not directly the executive power, which we don't think is enough, because the executive power has become way more important and powerful in today's society than it has ever been before, because it's very large and because of the existence of many money-driven lobby influences. Second of all, we would like to show how the lack of control by the people in regards to the government has allowed politicians to say one thing and then once elect to do something completely different. And finally, why we think that moving towards a more direct democracy is generally better for everybody. So, first of all, voters have no say in government. If you're talking about democracies, you're either talking about a presidential system or the parliamentary system that we have in Europe. In both cases, we don't elect the people who make and implement our policies. In the parliamentary system, we vote for the legislative, but it is then the parliament itself that forms government, which means that government is responsible to the parliament, which we think is not necessarily connected enough with the people because it has 4-year terms. Elections are far between. So we think that this effectively gives leverage to the government. It gives breathing space to the government that was formed by the representative body and is not directly connected with the people. So we think this has a democratic deficiency in terms that we have not elected the people who are essentially running the country, which is like presidents, prime ministers, and other heads of the executive. In the presidential system, it's pretty much the same. We don't elect the president, it's elected by federal units, and then he is the one who solely decides what his cabinet is going to be. And we find this problematic because he has complete autonomy to appoint anybody he wishes. We see this as problematic in terms of democratic influence of the people on their governments, because there's these steps in between. We also think it's very problematic because then politicians have a way more levy in terms of how they then implement their policies, or sometimes abandon it completely. If we look at governments the way they're formed in parliamentary systems, such as the one we have in Serbia, we see that we get these surprised coalitions that had nothing to do with people's will, which is why people managed to vote predominantly for the Serbian Advanced Party and for the Serbian Democratic Party, yet our Prime Minister is from the Serbian Socialist Party, even though nobody, less than 15% voted for him. Because when they started forming coalitions, the parliamentary started making deals, we ended up with a government that we did not vote for. We see this is very problematic because ultimately this very Prime Minister, who was the first one to say we will never give up Kosovo, is now negotiating about its independence. Whether this is a good or a bad thing, we don't really care. The thing is, he got elected on a completely different platform. And because he became Prime Minister through his bargaining power in the parliament, we think that we ended up with a government that we did not elect, that essentially does not feel it has connection to the people and can make policies. When making its policies, it feels more responsible to the parliament rather than its own promises to the people. Radu.
Is it not the case that these people are still accountable to those elected directly by the people? You still have checks and balance systems. You still have the parliament being able to give a vote of no confidence to that particular government if the people in the constituency feel it does not reflect their wishes.
No, but we think that usually this does not happen. The vote of confidence comes from the parliament, but we think that what parliament wants and what the people want can usually differ very greatly, because generally we have parliamentarians tend to be career politicians and think in 4-year terms. This is why we propose to implement our policy, which I probably should have said in the first place. But we think that the people should have a right to dismiss any government if they can if they can gather enough a census that is necessary to make laws, which in Serbia is 100,000 people need to agree for you to have a census for a referendum, and then have a referendum like you normally do. We believe that this number can change depending on the country and the population, but usually the same, yada, yada, yada. We also think it's very, sorry. Never mind. We also think this is very important because this gives accountability to the government directly to the people. They are now no longer feel that it's the parliament they need to impress and need to woo. It is now the people who hold them in power throughout their entire term. We think this is very important. We feel, because if we look at what governments sometimes do, that they go directly against people's wishes. If we look at what is happening in the United States with the Wall Street movement, Wall Street protest movement, we see that many of them were outraged by the fact that Obama decided to bring in the top managers from the financial institutions that eventually caused the great economic crisis, which is why most of his part of his economic government was called the Goldman Sachs government, because he figured, well, if we bring in financial managers, they're going to somehow fix the economy. To most people, this seemed like the perpetuation of the elites, in terms that you simply brought the people who created the problem, and now they're going to somehow magically, fix the problem, but in fact, they're as not being elected officials, but appointed officials. We have doubts regarding to their motives. This is why we believe that people, for example, all the United States of America, should have a right to say, no, we do not accept this government. We're not proposing that the people we should have elections every time we have this referenda. The legislative body would stay the same. But the government that is appointed, not elected, would be dismissed once the people go to this referenda. This is also part of the plan that I probably should have mentioned first. Because so essentially what we're proposing is that once you have enough people signing a petition that is necessary to change laws, this is the same number of people who can then initiate dismissal of appointed government officials, not elected ones, but those that were either appointed by a president or a parliament. We believe this is necessary because these people don't have a sufficient democratic accountability towards the people whom they are representing. And in fact, because of this, they often will have their own motives at heart rather than what the people wanted and why they elected them for. This is why we believe this sort of direct democracy mechanism needs to be implemented. For these reasons, please vote pro.
So, Mr. Speaker, we believe that at the present we have enough checks and balances in a democracy. We don't need to elect the members of the government. As I'm going to explain in my speech, I'm going to explain why by electing the government, it's actually going to affect how the political discourse works in a society, the way in which the voters think, and then I'm going to explain, actually this is what I'm going to bring first, I'm going to explain why this actually harms the development of the society because of the fact that the government will no longer focus on bringing long-term changes and structural changes, but rather focusing on short-term measures in order to gain political support on behalf of the voters. But before that, I have 2 points of rebuttal directly to what I've heard from my previous speaker. First of all, we already have a system of checks and balances in the society, and this was the PI that Radu asked. Why is that? Because we have a separation of power in the society. We have a clear cut between the government, the parliament, and the judicial system. Every time when there is a mistake, each part of these three powers can be held accountable through different mechanisms throughout how the judicial system works. Also, we have the instrument of the vote of no confidence that the parliament can give. And they said that, well, it is very rare that the parliament offers a vote of no confidence. Well, we believe that when the parliament does not offer a vote of confidence, we believe that the will and the desire of the voters is actually respected, because it actually means that what the government proposed and how the government works, it's coherent to what the parliament thinks, and therefore it's coherent to what the population thinks, because the population elected the parliament. I'm going to explain more on that. So I believe that they have to explain in this debate why exactly citizens, no thank you, are the ones who have to become a part of these checks and balances. I believe that citizens are not the best stakeholder. They should never be the ones who choose the government in a democratic. They can choose the parliament, they can choose the president, have no problem with it, but not the government. Why is that? First of all, because they are subjective, and second of all, because they cannot be held accountable for the choices they make, but the parliament can be held accountable by the fact that they won't be re-elected after their term for the choices they make. So if they give a vote of confidence to a government that does only crap, they will no longer be elected by the citizens. And this is how they can actually be held accountable by their choices. And this is why I believe that exactly the parliament is the one that has to appoint, to give the vote of confidence to the parliament. Secondly, they say that people of the parliament and not the government believe that it doesn't matter, because they don't vote a person, they vote policies, they vote measures, they vote a certain set of measures and ideologies. So basically, who wins the elections, in presidential elections or parliamentary elections, they get to appoint the government. So we believe that there is a reason why it's those persons exactly that decide who is going to be part of the government, in order to have a coherent government, a functional government. Because otherwise, if you elect all the persons that are involved in the decision-making process of democracy, you basically risk of having lots of blockages in the way the decision-making process works, because you no longer have a coherent, because it is a huge risk of not having elected persons from the same party or from the same political alliance, and we believe this is a very detrimental thing. Okay, so let's see on a comparative on short-term versus long-term decisions and how voters think. Voters think, their psychologists, they focus on immediate and not yet shorter effects. What they only analyze how their pockets are hurt, how their tomorrow life will be changed. For instance, that's why it would be very hard to implement austerity measures, because they will immediately go against that, because they will know that you have to suffer. And we believe that in some societies, austerity measures are important and have to be implemented in order to make the society go pass over some problems that it has, economical problems. So what it actually does, it hurts the development of the society, because politicians will only adopt populistic measures that are according to what the peoples want to have tomorrow, the next day, or the day after tomorrow, instead of focusing on long-term change. So second point, why we need long-term measures for structural change, because every structural change, every long-term policy needs a certain sense that, yes, before that.
Would you then also agree that we should have legislative times of like 20 years to actually make nice?
We believe that 5, 6, 7 years is enough. We have a reason why there is this amount of time in all democracy between 5 or 4 or 6 years, because there is enough time for structural change to happen, but you also have enough time for them to be accountable in front of their people, because after those 6 years, people can actually, they don't forget. If you would have 20 years, they would forget what happened 20 years ago, but they don't forget what happened in the last 4, 5, 6 years. So, basically, all structural change has to go through some phases: the planning, the building institutions, appointing personnel, creating infrastructure. The implementation takes time. The impact of that measure takes time. All that needs time. That's why we have representative democracy, and this is why people put their trust in the politicians they elect, that they will make the best choices for them, that they will present the decisions that they make. Or at the end of the term, these people, the politicians, the parliamentary, and the presidents will be accountable for what they have done. Both the parliaments towards the electors and both the parties that will be part of the government because of what they had. What are the harms? First of all, it changed the nature of political discourse, because every time a proposition or a project will every time the opposition party will always look how they can leverage and how they can use that in their own interest in order to gain political support, in order to convince population to go against the government, instead of focusing on how to implement it and make it happen. Practically, you change the political debates because you focus on mistakes, on what they didn't do, rather than how can you try to find solutions. Also, it impedes collaboration between parties, because they will have no reason to focus on long-term collaboration, because they will have to work together for 4 or 5 years, but they will be able to change at any given point. So we believe that it is a very harmful point in any democracy, because the way in which parties function and parties collaborate actually creates the premise for structural change and for measures. Last point, because it decreases the responsibility of the voters, because it's a shift in the way in which they think, because they will no longer have to assume responsibility for what they have done, because they will know that they can change at any given point those that are elected, instead of letting them decide for them for 4, 5, 6 years. For these reasons, please oppose.
I thank the speaker for your remarks. Now I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister for the next case for the Jure.
Don't let me send you the public. Goran, please don't kill me. 1 point of rebuttal, everything else will be interwoven. Hopefully, if I ever be able to do an interwoven rebuttal, this is going to be this time. So 1 point of rebuttal is about this whole separation of powers, right? They have this idea that in modern day democracies we have an absolute separation of power, which ensures a system of checks and balances in which we can have absolute accountability towards politicians. But we see this as false, because the legislative and the executive and the judicial are basically interwoven in a very real way. Once you have Obama, which is the president, or George W. Bush, who is able to appoint the judge or the judges of the Supreme Court, then you have the president, the executive council, the executive board, effectively controlling the judiciary, because any sort of appeal that goes on to the Supreme Court is basically going to be accepted or squashed based on who is going to be in the Supreme Court. So if it's anti-gay legislation, if it's a Republican Supreme Court, it's more likely to get squashed. If it's a Democratic, it's more likely to be accepted. So we don't have this absolute checks and balances, A. And B, even if we did have absolute checks and balances, more checks and balances can hurt. And this is the idea of the proposition team. If we have more checks and balances, we have a more direct democracy and more will of the people in government, and this is something that we find is beneficial. The rest is 4 points of constructive matter and interwoven things. One is about these terms. Now, we feel that terms in democracies are basically something that we have to do, because we have to give politicians time. But terms, basically what they do at the same time as giving politicians time to enact their policies, are basically time for politicians not to enact their policies as well. Are times where we don't have direct accountability of politicians towards the people. And no, this is when we see that this political accountability doesn't in fact work, is that by the time, if you enact, this is what happens in the US, you try to enact the most anti-populist policies in your first year, and then work for the rest of 3 years in order to appease the people, right? This is what happens, and we think that this is bad, because every time you do something that is against the will of the people, this is going to tie into my third point here, or fourth, depending on how it goes, it is against democracy, right? We think that whatever happens in a democracy, if it is the will of the people, it is good. Even if it is not progressive, it's just showing that we need more public discourse, and we need more social consensus on certain issues before we have legislation and before we have the state condoning it, right? This is what we are saying, right? So this is the idea of terms. People still get elected because they have ways of doing it. You have in the US using the culture of fear in order to get Bush re-elected in his second term because he was the only president who could protect you from the damn terrorists. You have the same thing in Serbia where Daesh ruled for 10 years just because they said that everyone else was going to lead to the demise of Serbia, to the destruction of the Serbian society. This is how this political accountability thing doesn't simply work in modern day world, because you have mass media, because you have propaganda, and because you have experts telling politicians exactly what to say and how to say it in order to get re-elected, in order to play on people's deepest fears and hopes, regardless of what they did during their term times, regardless of how much they went against the people's wishes. This is what we are saying, that term times are necessary, but they are a necessary evil. No, thank you. Now, the second thing is about accountability, and why opposition doesn't, in fact, provide accountability is because politicians, as my partner said, are career politicians. As career politicians, they are less likely to do things, they're less likely to bring the government down if they have a cushy seat where they can simply sit back and criticize the government's faults. And every opposition has done this. They've criticized the government's faults in order to get political points, in order to not only get re-elected, to get elected later on, but get re-elected, to maximize their chances of staying in government for as long as they can. We think that this provides a disincentive for these people to bring down the government when it is necessary, simply because they are career politicians and it is not in their personal best interest, but because even if it is in the personal best interest of the people. And we think that people will use this referendum responsibly. It's a lot of votes to get, right? Not everyone is going to go out on the street and looking for. So we think that the most divisive issues in society are the ones that are going to be implemented, are concerned with this policy, and we think this is good. Plus, it's a huge logistical leap, right? You have huge logistics that are going to have to be created. You have huge amounts of time before the referendum actually takes place, and you have a huge social dialogue between these 2 points. So people are going to use it responsibly. We don't see that this is going to lead to any sort of populist measures. Third thing, right? We think that we live in a representative democracy, but we would rather live in a direct democracy. Direct democracy is the ideal, is what we are going to do. So any form of policy that is going to shift the representative democracy more towards the direct democracy is a very good thing, right? We think that also politicians are less likely to enact policies that go against the will of their people if they know that the will of the people can bring them down in a more direct sort of way. So we think that this is also, just a little bit later, this is also a very good thing, right? But you also see that before every election, before every referendum, we have months and months of dialogue in society. Is it going to be a yes vote or is it going to be a no vote? By then, we have huge dialogue. We have mass media who are going to say, we have people going to say yes, we have people going to argue for no. Then we have people crystallizing their desires, crystallizing what they want to do with a certain policy. Do we want to go into Iraq or don't we want to go into Iraq? Do we want to go into Kosovo or don't we want to go into Kosovo? We see that not only are you going to have more direct democracy, you're going to have more informed voters, just a second, who are going to have a bigger influence on policy that before it is enacted and before they are taking responsibility, because every American is blamed for Afghanistan and Iraq, not just the US president. Go.
The problem is that it will be
go.
It's really impossible to pass progressive or pro-minorities legislation because
excellent. No, it's not impossible. It's just less. It just takes more time, and we think that it should take more time because once you take oppressive measure against far-right people who argue against anti-gay, you garner support for far-right people who argue against anti-gay. You argue for support for them from anarchists. You argue support for them from libertarians. You accrue support for them from every aspect of society who likes the little guy who doesn't think the state is good, and then you have more populist support for these crazy people. We think that the way to go is having social discourse, for even if it takes a little longer, and then social acceptance of certain societal norms that are going to be enacted into policy. We think that as a state is a neutral moral actor and should be a neutral moral actor, it should and has to go with the democratic principle and with the social consensus and with the will of the people, even if it is sometimes not progressive. It may take more time, but these things will get enacted into law. And because of all of these reasons, we beg you to propose.
Thanks for the speech, and I'll call for further engage with the opposition to your hearing.
This is going to be fast. you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, I have quite a lot to go through. What I'm going to do is bring about 2 very brief points of rebuttal, I couldn't fit them anywhere. Talk a lot about the role of the government and the reason we have separation in state, and why in principle that actually goes directly against a lot of the points that they're actually trying to bring about in terms of having accountability towards the government and the proximity towards its citizens. And afterwards I'm going to be talking about the opposition's change in the way that the political narrative is going to be shaped and how that's going to be problematic in the decision-making process. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking about political decision-making process as a whole, and how that whole discourse is going to be skewed. Now, before I do that, I have the two promised brief points of rebuttal. The previous speaker spoke a lot about how the culture of fear and the political discourse in Serbia led to wrong decisions for some reason because of the fact that we had terms. That's inaccurate. People on the very short term agreed to have the Patriot Act implemented within them because the discourse of fear was taking place. That had nothing to do with the fact that there was a term in place, but rather the fact that discourse was used. And unfortunately, the proposal will not remove such discourse from the policymakers to begin with. So we don't see that particularly relevant. No, thank you. No, that was acrobatic of you. The second point that I want to bring forward is this idea that the referendums will make the governments more responsible and engage with their citizens. What we say to this is that the main problem here. Oh no, they're saying that the referendum will be used responsibly, not at every bloody opportunity. But the problem that you're doing that you're changing within status quo is that you're shifting the burden on the government to always second doubt and always have that fear in their decision-making process on whether or not this is populist, whether or not this will have majority support, despite the fact that this might be progressive and this might be needed. We think that the very fact that skews their decision-making process is going to be problematic, and I'm going to touch upon that in my first point, which is exactly this, the role of the government, right? Because I think what they're doing is they're neglecting the reason we have a separation of power in between them. They're saying they're interwoved. That's perfect. That's exactly why we believe that if you hold one of them accountable that has control over the others, then that's sufficient, and you don't need direct control over each individual one to begin with. But the main problem is that they're neglecting the role of the government to begin with, because they somehow see the government as designing policies, which is inaccurate, right? Okay, in the US you might have the executive branch having quite a bit of power, and it fluctuates. But fundamentally, the reason we have a separation of power and we have a parliament and we have an executive branch is because of exactly that. The legislative branch, which is the parliament, develops policies, and then they assign power and authority to the executive branch to implement it. That is the way that the separation of powers operates within the state. This is why the legislative power already has checks and balances systems over its government to make sure that they are doing the policies that they say right. And this is why we hold the parliament accountable for whether or not they've designed the right policies. No, not yet. The problem is, when it comes to implementing policies that have been designed by the will of the people, i.e. by the parliament, you do need key experts, right? You do need the Goldman Sachs of economics to implement the right economic policies, because those are the best bloody people to do it. They might not be the most loved ones, but guess what? Most of the decisions that the governments have to take are not necessarily the most loved ones, but rather the best ones for the greater interest of society. What we believe is fundamentally the executive branch should be put in a position where it is protected to be warranted to make harsh calls in terms of implementing the policy that the parliament has done. As long as we control the parliament by the will of the people, we believe that that responsibility is done. No, thank you. And by the way, they keep on talking about this fact that the parliamentaries are career politicians and because of that they'll never want to take down government. That's false. Exactly by their own assumption that these guys are career politicians and they'll want to be re-elected, they will not hold in place a government that is so loathed by the people that next time when they are going to run for election, they're going to be asked, why the hell did you keep the Goldman Sachs there? If they don't have a bloody good reason for doing that, then they will lose the re-elections. I.e., the very assumption that they are career politicians mean that they will hold the governments in place and in balance. Don't you agree?
So these smart experts from Goldman Sachs, are they shaping policies in the government?
No, they're not. They're implementing the policies dictated by the parliament, right? They're implementing the laws that have been designed by parliament. They might have some decision-making power in terms of how do we implement these policies, right? There is some leeway, but the brunt fundamental policies and principles are dictated by parliament in any old democracies. That is the principle behind it. There are such things as ordinances of urgency, right, where the government actually impledes a law, but then that law is held accountable by the House of Parliament, so it still needs to be represented within the Parliament. It is fundamentally the Parliament that decides what and all policies are implemented within the state, and this is why we have a separation of powers. Now, why is it that we have a problem actually in terms of the way that we're changing the discourse of narrative? No, thank you. The problem is that fundamentally what we're doing is we're giving the opposition an ace in the sleeve, right? Because fundamentally the opposition, what they have to do now that they are in opposition to gain power is to switch populist. Scrap old political ideologies. You don't need to hold on to your socialist or your liberal platform that you had in the past because you've lost that election. All you need to do now is every time the people in power make any call is simply make populist claims in terms of how much that will damage them on the long run and how much that will hurt their pockets and how much that will starve their children. And then all of a sudden, you're bringing down the government. You're shifting the narrative from the things that matter to sheer populist discourse, which is problematic. But it even goes further than that because you're incentivizing, you're giving a gross incentive to the people in opposition to filibuster the decision-making process to begin with, right? Think of Obama. If this policy had been in place under Obama trying to put in Obamacare, which was filibustered constantly by the opposition, if the opposition had a constant incentive to understand, wait, if that policy doesn't go through and we keep on blocking it and he fails under his promises, then ultimately people will bring him down, then we're never going to have a bipartisan decision-making process. We're never going to agree to any bipartisan decision, but rather keep on blocking the system until people get fed up with the blockage and bring that particular person down. What we're saying is that the opposition is no longer someone working towards a bipartisan solution, but rather constantly blocking everything that the people in power are trying to do, and that is not the healthy way to run a democracy, and this is why we believe that this fails. Secondly, my colleague has already talked to you a lot and hasn't been thoroughly addressed in terms of the short-term versus long-term perspective, right? Because what we believe is that fundamentally, and this is why she was talking about austerity measures, fundamentally when we're talking about austerity measures, the people in opposition will no longer be talking about the economic implications of this on the long run and whether or not the economic model will be viable, but rather their emphasis will revolve around, well, that's 25% less of money that you have in your pocket, go figure, bring down the government. And that's all they have to do, and this is how you're destroying the political discourse that's happening in our societies. We believe that is a fundamental problem. At the same time, what we're doing is we're de-responsibilizing, that's not a word, we're shifting the responsibility from voters when they're voting in terms of, I need to take accountability for the next 4 years and assign someone that is thorough and look at his political platform, but rather think in the short term along the lines of, yeah, I'll just put a stamp anywhere, because if they do something that I don't like, I'll just take them down tomorrow. And that shifts away the burden and the discourse from real, hardcore facts and policies to simple populist decision-making processes. And this is what we hate about this proposal. Please oppose.
Anyway, all right. Thank you. Oh.
It's not a touch.
Oh, it's not a touchscreen. There we go. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, Gora. Now, and other judges. Okay. So I'm going to talk about how this will actually work and what it will actually do in the long run, because it's been completely scooped by opposition. I mean, it's not as if they haven't even listened to the entire proposal. Just to reiterate, first brought you the case where you need 100,000 signatures. That's a lot. And it's going to be proportional, of course, to the size of the population. So in the United States, it's going to be like 10 million or something like that. And then a majority vote. It's not going to be about every thought that citizens don't like that a politician lets run, right? So that's the first thing. Secondly, they actually bring a lot of things about the proposition that are simply not going to work out that way. I'm going to bring you two things. First of all, how will this actually work out? I'm going to analyze that well. Secondly, what will it do in the long run and why it's actually good for long-term policy. Now, so to start off with the first thing, just to get back to the whole thing about, the first opposition speaker saying how there are already checks and balances.
yeah, kind of don't really work. Because what do we see in most parliaments? Most parliaments, you have a coalition government ruling. The coalition parties have a majority. That majority means that they are the only, the coalition parties are actually the only people that can vote down the government. What happens if you vote down a government? It makes your party look bad, because parties that fall from government probably have done something wrong in the eyes of the voters. That means that there's a vested interest for the politicians that can vote down the government not to vote down the government, because even if they don't mind losing their job and their income, which I believe they actually do, they will still lose the chance to actually work out their ideals. And so there's actually strong incentive for ruling parties to keep in power and for ruling parliamentarians to keep the government in power. This has not been very well analysed by opposition. So secondly, no thanks. Secondly, there were a lot of things mentioned by especially the second speaker who we just heard, that, you know, oh, there's abuse of the appointment of judges. There's an abuse of the appointment of whatever. There's abuse of filibustering. First of all, we don't really have filibustering in most European systems. We don't really have appointing judges in most European systems. If you have an issue with that, address that. It's not what the proposition is about. So we don't really believe that is relevant. Secondly, they kind of made it seem as if all these things that they mentioned, this entire proposal will actually lead to an impeachment policy being called every single day. And this is basically my most major point and my second major point of rebuttal before I go into my constructive, namely that how will it work out? Ops make it seem as if it will happen every other week. We don't really think so. We don't really think so, because first of all, as an opposition party, it will look very silly if you call an impeachment procedure over every thought that the government actually lets run. And you know, it's going to be, you have an incentive to actually look serious and look like you're not just trying to bring down the government for the hell of it. We see that actually, even if you have even one impeachment procedure, such as for instance the Bill Clinton impeachment, a lot of people on a lot of political sides were actually like, well, this is actually a really bad thing. I mean, this is like, why would we bring down the guy? It's a serious thing, but people will treat it as such. So it won't just happen every other week. And second, this will actually help educate voters, because we will because it's not going to happen every other week. It's not going to happen about short-term things. It's going to happen about long-term, big-time issues that voters need to be educated about. And we say it's actually good to have the discussion, because it will be because voters will be more educated that way. Okay, so what will happen secondly? So first of all, it's going to happen. It's going to get into more constructive. First of all, it's going to lead to better policy. Second of all, it's going to be leading to more honesty. And third of all, it's going to lead to explaining things better to voters. So, and you can actually get POIs on this side, because now it's going to be constructive. So, better policy, right? We see currently that policy is actually made haphazardly. It's about forming coalitions. It's about seeing what actually works in the polls. It's about horse trading. And voters hate this. If there's one thing that leads to political wariness among voters, about of hatred for the political class, it's the fact that voters feel they just feel duped. They hear all these election promises, they hear all these things during elections, and then come coalition time, it's like, okay, well, you guys get this, you guys get this. You get a watered down compromise. Nothing actually looks like the thing that you voted for in the first place. And this is actually what our side proposition will actually go against. Why? Because basically, it's not going to be striking down laws, as first opposition pretended to be. It's going to be about striking down entire government. That is actually what the proposition said. It's about striking down governments. So, which means that it's not going to be about incongruity in government policy. It's going to be about the large picture. It's going to be about, you know, when a government says A, does B, or says A, does X, or does X and Y at the same time, because, you know, the coalition partner just happened to be that happened to want it that way. It would otherwise threaten to blow up the coalition. So it's going to be serving, therefore, the purpose of actually fostering holistic government policies. Second half.
Yes, basically the entire issue that the entire proposition side is propping is due to the electorate process being a proportional one or majority one. Why do you not change the electorate process and solve every single problem? Why do you go against the government?
We don't really change the electoral process because we believe that parliaments and elections are a good thing to have. We just want to check extra balance. And we believe it will lead to better policy in the long run. So, what has actually happened? So basically what you have is it's about striking down governments. And governments actually have to come up with holistic things that actually work together, actually make it seem as if they actually know what they're talking about. Because only then will, only if this is not the case, only if the government as a whole will look shitty, then it might get impeached. And we're saying this is actually a good thing, because it's nice to have this way, this forcing of holistic policy that makes a lot of sense in the long run. Sorry for not interrupting, guys. So even if it is just about one issue, and the referendum does get through, and the majority does get fixed, it's probably such a divisive issue that's actually a good thing that the government falls over this. Because let's face it, if, for instance, Roma are going to be outlawed by a majority, but you still, or by the government, but you still get a majority against it, then it's actually a good thing that this has happened, right? So, secondly, about honesty, you actually have to tell an entire story. This kind of sort of flows from the point about holistic thing. You actually have to make sure that your story comes across, and that you actually have to back it up with actual honest policy, because otherwise you will get impeached. It's that simple. So it's going to lead to more honesty in campaigns, because when you will actually get kicked out of office for dishonesty during your campaign, that's a pretty good reason to be honest with things. That's actually going to make politicians more honest. After all, the voters hate dishonesty above all else. And how do you come across as honest? Simply by explaining issues to voters. Voters will understand your feelings better if you actually explain them. We believe that voters are smart. We believe that voters are actually interested in good policy, and I'm sure Marx will pick up on this better, because my time is finished. But that's because I had so much useful stuff to say, which is why you will vote proposition. Thank you very much. Да.
Okay. Thank you. What we are basically claiming as the extension speaker, what I will claim and what we'll bring to this debate, is 3 points of analysis on different subjects. Firstly, we'll talk about progressive discourse and how this would change the discourse, not in the opposition-proposition kind of way, but simply in the words being spoken by the politicians, which would be extremely harmful, especially for the minorities, which are the most harmed ones by these policies. Secondly, we will talk about international credibility and how a community of countries that are functioning this way is going to be an incredibly bad community, and a community in which you will have no trust whatsoever between the states. And thirdly, we will talk about why is it very dangerous to trust the people that much, and why, in our opinion, we should reduce the influence, the political influence of the wide masses and all the people on the minimum of things, which is basically you go to the elections, you vote, and that's enough from you. We don't want more input from you because of several reasons, which we will address later on. But before that, 2 brief points of rebuttal here. One, about the POI that Andrea was talking about, which was clearly misunderstood. The point is that all the issues that you raised today can be solved by different measures, by different political systems, by different electoral systems. In Germany, for example, you have mixed parliamentary system, okay? Half of the parliament, if I know, is being elected proportionally, half of them majorly, which means that you can hold accountable parts of your parliament like that. We have no problems with implementing, for example, the Westminster model of the UK everywhere, or some other model. The point is, accountability can be solved as an issue with different measures. One of them being simply abolishing the proportional model. Because the problem is they're making coalitions that we haven't been voting for, then why don't you change the political system or electoral system? That was the point of Andrija Jonovic. You haven't provided us with an explanation how the status quo of democracy per se is so harmful in all of the Western liberal democracies that you have to abolish the concept of democracy that we have today, and we have to change it to this extent. That is the point here. What they are advocating is basically some minor political system changes, and that can solve these problems. Second point is about horse trading, because that's how we got the extension from the second government. It was a bit unclear, but we got that part very clearly. The horse trading issue, we have 3 responses to that. One, firstly, we know what horse trading is here, right? Politicians, make a deal about policies and coalitions, etc., etc. Point is, it is good for democracy for 3 reasons. One, it is aggregating different interests. We believe that that's a legitimate tool to aggregate different interests that exist in our society, which we think that is good because competing interests and making a deal about different interests provides policies that are better off for the most of the population, or at least for the greater number of the population. Secondly, the problem is The second response is basically that is an extremely efficient way, for example, in proportional systems, to defend, to help the minority party groups to bail their rights, right? Because if they need, for example, 2 or 3 deputies in the parliament to implement certain policies, and they are from the minor groups, of course they can and they should blackmail the government for certain rights of their minorities and for certain standards. We think that's great because minorities already don't, because they are minorities, they need help from us to get more leverage on the government, and that is good. Thirdly, horse trading can be beneficial in the long run, which we have seen with our brilliant Serbian government, which have brought us many good things. For example, bringing the European integration process much faster and concluding peace agreement with Kosovo, which is something that is very important. Therefore, even if the coalition that was formed later on wasn't the one that we voted for, it doesn't mean that it will necessarily be bad for us. And we disagree with the notion of the government that if the majority says that it's good, we should implement it. We prefer to live in a country that has good policies than the ones that the majority wants, because these two things are not necessarily the same. No, thank you. Now, moving on to my constructive. First part about this discourse. Yes, they said progressive policies will not be implemented. That's clear as hell, right? Progressive policies will not be implemented because they are way too grave, because people will reject them. Like, for example, gay marriages in France. Imagine if we had like a referendum in France right now, most probably people will vote against it. But the problem with minorities and progressive policies, which we will just expand on here, is basically that minorities cannot wait for the majority to be aware of their problem. They are usually not aware of their problem because they are minorities and they don't care. And people don't have on their priority list the rights of the endangered people in their societies. They're thinking about other issues. Therefore, mostly, they just don't care about that. And we shouldn't let that be decided by the people who simply don't care enough about that. But moreover, we believe that will change political discourse in the sense of narrative which will be spoken, which will be taken. We have in these democracies in which we have a lot of, for example, authority of the people. We think that that's highly problematic because the words that politicians will use will mostly be aggressive towards minorities. That can happen, of course, because if they are completely susceptible to volatile powers of majority, they will suck up to them all the time. They will not even wait for the 4 years and maybe implement some progressive reform, but they will try to talk things that they like all the time, which is even harming what is proven to be in the status quo the case, which is when you warmonger or scaremonger people, they tend to be irrational. This will be even worse by their policies because it will happen more often, not just every 4 years, but even more often. But now moving on to the second part of my extension, and it's about international credibility. Two points here. A, we believe that predictability is very important in international relations. Nations actually can talk to each other, can negotiate, can form certain agreements based on predictability. Countries which are volatile by simply giving so much political power to majority of people are not the countries that will be predictable actors. And why is this important? That's the second point. A lot of peace arrangements in history was made by brave leaders, brave politicians, and brave governments who didn't have support of their own people. We believe that in these cases, it is very important. It shows just the point that sometimes government has to lead the people, not only to follow it. Peace agreements are a crucial element of here, like, for example, the Camp David Accords, etc., etc. What we believe also here is, and that is the third part, basically people simply shouldn't have that much power. Why? Two responses on that. One, they tend to be irrational, they tend to be emotional, especially when they are in large numbers. They identify themselves with the groups, they get scared easily, like any other people, but politicians are trained not to get scared, right? And the majority can be, by populist rhetorics, be scared into basically deciding anything. And second response is, this simply isn't Athens. The notion of humanities as sciences came to us from all the knowledge that Athenian people had to have in order to include itself in politics. Therefore, today's average voter is much less educated than Athenian. Therefore, it shouldn't decide on these things.
One in the crowd.
Who's crying of you? It wasn't that bad, come on.
Thank you.
All right. I'm happy to stand here to actually change the system with a minor change but a big effect for the better. I will have 3 points how this thing will actually work, where we have the premise that opposition probably is doing smart things, and they have the promise that they're obviously running into an election every second week. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how the policies will be affected, where we stand on a position where we believe that voters can be smart occasionally, and they stand on the position that they're entirely stupid and irrational. And then we have another thing. Yeah, what was the third one? Fuck, I wrote it down and I circled it. Oh yeah, and then we have the third premise, which is resting on their case. They say that probably there's an election about every single law that is passed, which is not true. If I prove to you that these premises are wrong, we probably win this debate. So, how is this going to happen? We do have a mechanism where you have to gather 100,000 votes, and then you put it to a public vote where you need to get a majority. That is a very lengthy process. You need to plan it carefully. You need to use this tool carefully. This does not happen every time, and this does not happen over every issue. What will happen in reality is that you will have a government which has an opposition, and if the government does something which is bad, the opposition will probably do something. For example, if the government is in Hungary and they're doing bad and terrible stuff, the populace can get rid of this government that wants to change the constitution because it doesn't agree with it anymore. That is a good thing. The other thing that could happen is that the government promised something and doesn't keep the promises. So the opposition actually thinks and believes that they can change the political government because it now has a majority. If the opposition would just do it because probably voters would think, well, this is borderline too stupid, or this is just power brokering, sit down, or something like this. We don't think there's an actual political gain by doing this every time. And when we're talking about minority legislation, I imagine a situation most favorable to your case and still think it's not possible. So you do have a case where a government runs a premise like, for example, we want to give gays more rights, like, for example, the right to marry. Because it's a good thing, we believe it's a nice thing. So the opposition would have to stand up and would have to prove in a populist election that gays are inferior, which is a discourse that is probably having to held. We don't believe that an opposition will risk this tool, which they use only rarely, on such an issue where they are likely to run on an inhuman course. They will do it over corruption things, they will do it over policies that actually don't work, and they will do it if a government doesn't work at all. So, for example, not it's dysfunctional or it's just too lazy or too timid to actually do something. We do believe that the social advancement of progressive legislation still can happen. And that leads me to my second point. How do we lead this to better policies? Well, Michael already said it. Firstly, if you make a promise before you get elected, like, for example, harmful policies like austerity, and you then do that what you promised, the people have no reason to throw you out because you delivered your promise you were voted on in. This leads to the fact that politicians under our model will probably be more honest before elections because that reduces their risk after elections. And then you say, yes, but voters are stupid. They will never vote something unpleasant. Well, newsflash, the Greek people voted for austerity. There is a majority of the Greek population voted for parties that were pro-austerity. That is a fact. Merkel ran on increasing taxes. People still voted her into office. The Green Party in Germany is running on extreme increase in taxes. That is their platform. And Monsieur Hollande ran on an insane increase in taxes, and he still got elected. So the pockets are not the decisive issue on your side. Voters occasionally can vote on values and not only on money. So that said, what is about the term length? We had this little turmoil here about how long has the term to be effective. Well, we believe if you propose a policy, that is not a lengthy thing. You say, I want to do this, and then you start doing it, and then the policy takes effect. A good policy to take effect, for example, an economic policy, probably needs 5 to 10 or maybe 15 years. It is not a 2-year thing or a 3-year thing or a 7-year thing. We don't believe you can draw a line somewhere. But one thing we can see, if something is really going against the will of the people, and with will I do not mean the opinion they might have, with will I mean what they actually need, the opposition will probably seize the moment and go for it to actually impeach that government. They won't do it out of any occasion. Go.
But sir, what you didn't understand from our case is that we didn't say the opposition will use this tool every time. But every time there's a political debate, the opposition will keep on stacking up populist political will on their behalf to ultimately build up for
exactly. And this is a good thing that we do have this threat. It is a good thing that the opposition has this tool to get rid of a government which is voted in for 4, 5 or 7 years. Why is that so? Because it leads to one very brilliant thing. It was horse trading, it was freight, but actually it is explanation. If you do something which can harm people, which is your entire case, you can do it now by just doing it fast and swiftly and then hope the people forget it in 3 years. If there is an opposition stacking up will, you need to do one thing. You need to explain stuff. You need to explain to people why taxes need to be increased. You actually need to explain, morality-wise, why this minority needs to be protected. And I do firmly believe that most people in our society are generally humane people who are decent enough to actually admit that sometimes it's good to help people rather than harm them. So, also peace is a thing I believe 99% of all people usually share as a value. Okay, maybe in Serbia it's only 90%. Anyway, so I do believe selling these points is possible. And it is helping the cause. It is helping against the wariness, the political wariness we have in the Western system. And then we have another clash that was in first half mainly, namely what is a parliamentary system. So they were basically saying the case that there is an interwoven of decision making. You were making the case that the government isn't forming policies at all, it is the parliament doing that. Well, I do believe in reality it is the case that the majority of parliament votes a government into their position, and they have working groups forming policies for the government, and the government gives inputs and sets agenda. Otherwise, having an expert from Goldman Sachs would be useless if you wouldn't actually try to form policies and everything. So this is what happens in reality. So this parliamentary thing actually also falls on our side. So, because voters are not entirely stupid and can be convinced, because people need explanation on social and other issues, and because the system is something that is used rarely and wisely and not every time you seize the opportunity, we can think that this is a brilliant thing to do. Thank you.
I think Speaker, for him, the actual number is much lower than that. I call upon delegates to demonstrate.
You people gave me a cancer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the floor. Now, what the entire side of proposition actually fails to fathom is the simple fact that this model is too radical, that this model is too unverified, and that this model will ultimately lead to far more harms than it does benefits. While we agree that their democratic notions and the idea that people need to get their best is a noble one, and we agree with you that we should implement something of a sort, we believe there is a far, far more simple alternative explained to you in about 20 to 25 seconds of our extensive speech. If you want to change the fact that you have a shitty political discourse in the parliament, based on the fact that you have coalition governments, i.e. you have the people not voted by the majority, so you have people going against the wishes of the majority, somehow that is ipso facto, by their case, I don't really see how. We have a problem. That problem can be solved by simply changing the electorate system. If you go and implement the majority system, then the party that has the most votes within the people gets to win, and then people get what they want on a majority level, right? We believe that also could be wrong when it comes to the minorities. Now, but before we actually begin to clash on the entire thing, no, thank you guys, I have to say one thing. How does democracy work, and how does democracy get implemented? Each one of us has this one piece of sovereignty. We delegate this sovereignty onto a specific political party or political individual that actually can advocate our voice in the parliament, in the discourse. No clarification, thank you. Now, then what happens is that the one party that gets the most of the sovereignty gets to lead us. That party gets to gets actually to advocate our voices in the parliament. And if you implement a majority system which adheres to that, about 95% of their case gets solved right away. And before we begin, we have actually one single clash in the entire debate. Whether or not the world will be a better place after this. Because actually whatever the hell they said was kind of pretty messy, especially from the extension, from the government. No, thank you, Marcus. Thank you. Actually, what we go through here is the fact that you will have more populism. Now, we actually do acknowledge the fact that people get voted for opposition. Exactly what Jure actually said in the beginning is the people rally behind their opposition, and the opposition are somehow, and I'll quote him here, career politicians, that's what he said, and somehow they only strive to take points away from the dominant party in the parliament, so they would somehow be more in office later on, and the people actually somehow feel rested behind their opposition. Well, actually, that's the problem. The discourse will change unto itself. The discourse will be far more populistic. Now people will not win on economic arguments, people will win on irrational, emotional arguments. I will adhere to your basic family values and whatnot. Well, guess what? Family values will not get you out of recession, right? It's exactly what happened in Greece. Nice spin by closing out. But actually, what happened there is you voted on a package of things. You do not vote on a single issue. Right now, within the status quo, you have the option of voting on a single issue through the referenda imposed by the government. Why the government? Because the government is a unified, devoted of emotions, totally objective, completely informed agent, right? Because actually, no, thank you. Actually, the government has access to far more information than your normal voter does. The government has access to far more international relations information than your regular voter does. The government is thus far more informed. The government thus has the ability to invoke referenda, to invoke discussion, right? And exactly where we believe that the entire case about people actually getting what they want falls down. Sorry. But what do we get here? No, thank you. What we get here is that they're claiming that the checks and balances system are not really working, that there's actually a lengthy process here, that there's much lobbyist interest in play, and the Goldman Sachs government from the first side of the proposition bench. Well, we believe that it was being dealt with by Rado quite well. Now, the elective process goes like this. You propose a policy, then experts weigh in to fine-tune the policy actually in order for it to make sense. Then legal framework gets in to actually fine-tune that policy for the parliament, and then parliament discusses on it. So it's not run by Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is an advisory body, right? And actually what we believe, and even if they're not an advisory body, even if they get to weigh in on certain issues, we believe that if a company is too big to fail, and if you have an entire economy relying on the backbone of a single market, of a single country, we believe that it should perspire, which is exactly what happened in the United States of America when General Motors did not fail. No thank you. Now, actually, we believe that people also are not a valid agent for change, because people are two things. People are mostly, in times of fear, as acknowledged by the entire proposition bench, are irrational. People are subjective to populist rhetorics when they say the Iraqi are going to go into your backyard and they're going to kill you all unless you vote on the Patriot Act. And then they voted 6 weeks after Ground Zero creation on the Patriot Act. An irrational thing, not read by the entire Congress, because their constituents were behind it, because all they have seen were people dying in the Twin Towers. We believe that's wrong. As much as it is bad, we believe it is wrong. And the second thing is, not only that they're afraid, they're not well informed. This may have worked 2,500 years ago, but not right now. Once you have a city-state where all the people are informed, we have roughly around 5,000 people, you actually get to know shit. When you have an entire nation, where you have millions and millions of people, where you have globalistic implementations of policies, people don't get to know everything. When people don't get to know everything, they vote on what they know. Because an abstract notion of economic progress is too far away from me getting my 13th paycheck as a Greek teacher. Not last chance. That's last chance. Go, Shu.
Okay, so we already accept in society the principle of direct democracy. So since we had state-run referenda, what we are saying is that if this does not happen, we have so many bad policies in the world simply because politicians in opposition refuse to use it. Give it to the people.
Not give it to the people, because you give it to the people will tear it apart. Because the people aren't rational. Because even the opposition that wins on populist rhetoric is not what people inherently want. No, thank you. Is not what people inherently want, because they actually win on populism. Nobody wins a program these days. And what we're advocating from the side of opposition, that this will only further deteriorate every single notion of every single civil activists out there that wants to shift the focus from populist rhetorics to the program. People do not get elected these days on program. This will only further the problem, right? And this, in turn, leads to less predictability in any single region where this policy is enacted, right? For instance, if within the European Union, you have this in Greece, and people have the ability to abolish governments, they would abolish the technocratic government, they would abolish even the democratic government that's voted on austerity measures, because they actually didn't have the far enough reach of a mind to predict what would happen if this got implemented. And if this happens, if the Greek people have the ability to actually deteriorate governments on a whim, we believe that investors are far less prone to invest. We believe that Germany will no longer bail them out. We believe that not even single one country will give something to any country if they do not have any concrete benefit. This happens to predictability on the international level. This leads to people feeling that they have more power, but actually leading themselves astray. And this leads to far less good policy. We believe that the entirety of their problem, even if we were to take them prima facie as true, could be solved by actually changing the electoral process itself. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.